evening, everyone, and welcome to the final installment of Great Decisions 2023. Thank you all for coming out on what is arguably the most decent weather night that we've had for any of these lectures. So thank you for coming out. Just before we get started, as always, I would like to make a couple of announcements, starting with thank yous. As always, our series sponsors. They came through for us to be able to present a wonderful series again this year. So I would like to thank the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Pops Christie, and Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So a huge round of applause for our sponsors. Then I would also like to thank some people that I haven't had the opportunity to thank this year who were instrumental in getting this series running. And that is the committee that gets all the speakers put together and contacts them, goes through the list of people that we have and gets the absolute best speakers we can get to show up. So some of them are here tonight, some aren't, but Darlene Wellner, Amy Cabro, who is new to the committee this year, Marilyn Sante, and Kathy Fishbeck, who did the lion's share of getting the speakers. So a huge round of applause for them. Also, Karen Hansen, who is behind the scenes, but she made sure that everything ran like clockwork behind the scenes. And Maximilian John, who helped me to get the online hybrid version of the lectures up and running and working every week. So thank you to them as well. And also to Linda McCabe, who was a real champ and ran around the room like Phil Donahue, getting you the microphone every week. So a huge thank you to her as well. The only other announcement before I introduce our speaker this evening is just to remind you once again, for the last time for a year, more or less, that our seed library just opened a couple weeks ago. So if you're into gardening with the weather seemingly moving towards spring, just remember you can get 4 packs of any of the seeds that we have in the seed library per visit, per household, every time you come to the library. And if you could harvest some of the seeds at the end of the year, that would be great. If you don't feel like it, it's not mandatory. So there is no cost. Just check out the seeds and start a garden. So now, without further ado, once I get my glasses back on, Elizabeth Wheat is an associate professor in public and environmental affairs and political science at UW Green Bay. She is originally from Marshall, Michigan, and completed her master's degree in public affairs at Indiana University and her doctorate in political science at Western Michigan University. She is currently pursuing a master's in social work at UW Green Bay and a field placement, at World Relief Working with Refugees. Elizabeth teaches courses in global environmental politics, environmental law and policy, natural resources, the presidency, fisheries and marine law, wildlife law, and sustainability. In most of her courses, students participate in mock trials, model United Nations simulations, or environmental policy debates. Elizabeth also serves on the board for Midwest Environmental Advocates, Wisconsin Conservation Voters, and the Green Bay Water Utility. Most importantly, she is a proud dog mama to 3 rescue pups. Poofy, Nightly, and the extremely energetic Foxy Loxy, and coexists with her adopted cat, a ragdoll named Dolly Pawton. So you're in for a treat. Without further ado, Professor Elizabeth Wheat.
You can imagine the family debates when we get to naming my animals, so it's fun. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's really good to be back in person. It's been a few years virtually, and so I'm very happy to be back talking about a really, I think, important, definitely a little bit dark and depressing at times, but as with any talk that I give, I always like to end with what we can do about it. It's great to come here and it's great to learn, but we'll wrap up with where I think we can go next. And so to give you a sense of kind of the picture with global famine, we are facing one of the most extreme situations of global famine with 345.2 million people that are projected to be food insecure in 2023. This is double what we faced in 2020 and 200 million more than pre-pandemic levels. 900,000 people are trying to survive in famine-like conditions. This is 5 times the rate of 5 years ago. With 828 million hungry people in the world, 349 million of those facing severe hunger, this is the largest global crisis in food history. And so as we'll get into this, famine is one slice of the food picture. Food insecurity and hunger are going to be important elements as well. So starting with what famine actually means. A lot of different definitions on this one. The UN will state that famine is declared when malnutrition is widespread and when people have started dying of starvation through a lack of access to sufficient nutritious food. So certain conditions have to be met before a famine can be officially declared, and we'll talk about the classifications that they use shortly. But it's important to remember that even though an area might not be officially a famine, there's still a lot of problems and still a lot of hunger and food insecurity. So what are some of the characteristics of a famine level? I'll try and talk about this here. Think of this really as a combination of multiple factors interacting, but there are going to be some primary characteristics. First is a lack of access to adequate food, and we'll go into more depth on what food insecurity means in a little bit. Acute malnutrition. This is a deprivation of essential vitamins that can lead to developmental delays and problems, also stunted growth, and make individuals more prone to disease. With poor health, we again have stunted growth, but also likelihood of a lot of other illnesses. And also underweight, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, that nutrition and food are really going to be connected to a lot of different aspects in our system. And then excess mortality is what a lot of the literature will call death. It sounds softer. People are still dying from food issues. And so when we're looking at those are, again, the famine characteristics, we also need to think about hunger and food insecurity. 45 million people are at the emergency phase of food insecurity, which is the last step before a famine is officially declared. The Food and Agriculture Organization, which is part of the UN, will describe hunger as physical discomfort caused by a lack of food. It becomes chronic if someone doesn't consume a sufficient amount of calories on a regular basis. Okay, and we'll talk about some of the factors that lead to that. With food insecurity, this is a little bit different. This is when someone lacks regular access to enough safe and nutritious food for normal growth and development. This may be due to an unavailability of food or the lack of resources to obtain it. And so we can see food insecurity at lots of different levels of severity. And so if someone is food insecure, they likely have run out of food and experienced hunger. So there's naturally going to be a relationship there. The classification system that the international community uses is the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. The UN will use this to compile data, and there's a lot of other good reports, but I think this one's pretty user-friendly. And so phase 5 is the famine stage. At phase 5, 20% of a population faces extreme food shortage. Acute malnutrition rates will be higher than 30%, and 2 out of 1,000 people will die daily from starvation. And so I'll show you the categories here. This may be a little hard to read, so I'll kind of talk through the main ones here. At the top, phase 1.
You got to get that clear.
Yeah, I'll talk you through it. But yeah, it'll be on. The picture is not quite as clear as I would like, but it's still a really good indicator. So I'll give you the highlights from this one. So I think if you had to take a test, we'll cover what you need to know. So in the green at the top, this says it's phase 1. So there's no real issues here. At phase 1, households are able to meet their essential needs, and they don't have to engage in any stressful strategies to access food. Okay. So at our response level on the far right column is more resilience building and reducing the risk of disaster. So we're okay at phase 1. At phase 2, in the lightest orange, is stressed. At this point, households have minimally adequate food consumption, but they're starting to experience issues with non-food expenditures unless they engage in more stressful coping strategies. Our response at that level is still disaster risk reduction, but we're thinking more about livelihoods and bigger income pictures. Phase 3, which is more of the construction orange, households at this point have food consumption gaps that are starting to trend towards acute malnutrition. We're starting to get very concerned at level 3. But they're marginally able to meet their needs, but only if they start depleting their household assets. And so it's a really big warning flag for what's to come. Our response at this level is now classified as urgent action required. And so at this point, we need to look very seriously at food consumption gaps. At stage 4, which is sort of the salmon coral level, households either have very large consumption gaps that have acute malnutrition rates and excess mortality, or they can mitigate those gaps, but only if they start liquidating their assets and taking really extreme financial measures. At stage 4, the response is still urgent action required, but now we're at the life-saving stage, okay? So we're still not even at famine yet, and it's getting pretty bad. So when we get to stage 5, which is the very bottom, the reddest of red, that is gonna be catastrophe, or famine. And so at this point, households have an extreme lack of food, basic needs are not being met, starvation, death, destitution, and critical acute malnutrition levels are evident. And there, as we talked about, those specific percentages that we need to have for that malnutrition. The action required at this stage is, again, urgent, but necessary to prevent and widespread death and total collapse of livelihoods. So a lot of the countries we're going to talk about with the case studies will be at different levels officially. Somalia is going to be the only one officially right now at a level 5, but the situation will be really dire in some of the other ones. This one walks you through the 4 parts with food security. I won't spend a ton of time on this here, but the big 4 areas are, in the blue, are availability, access, stability, and utilization. If any one of the 4 slices of the blue pie here are affected, it's going to affect the whole thing. And so if you look in the lower right in the stability, that includes price, political, economic, and weather. We'll talk more about how climate change and climate shocks are affecting this. That's going to destabilize an entire section of this food security pie. That's going to affect purchasing and transport. That's going to affect production capabilities and aid access. It's certainly going to affect storage and transportation. So any one slice can affect another part. And in areas of conflict, the whole pie is going to be impacted. So we'll take a look at some of the causal factors of famine. Conflict is going to be one of the biggest here, and this will be a very common theme in the case studies that we'll discuss shortly, and it's also one of the most difficult barriers in addressing famine. 70% of the world's hungry people live in areas facing war and violence. And so we'll look at a few examples of how conflict will contribute to famine. These include forced displacement, barriers to food and income, blocking humanitarian access, and economic decline. So conflict is really going to disrupt multiple areas of life, and especially if there are communities that live off the land, conflict is going to jeopardize their agriculture and livestock activities as well. Additionally, people are not able to work or earn money, and so we've all experienced rising food prices in recent years, And for people already struggling with poverty, that can be really devastating to have those rise as well. And then depending on the conflict, we'll talk about a few case studies that where the aid organizations are not able to reach affected people. And so maybe it's the warring parties are attacking civilians, or blocking transportation routes, or we're seeing with both Yemen and the Ukraine blocking ports, so aid can't get in that way. Conflict is going to present a lot of those barriers. We also have the challenge of increased migration. So individuals fleeing to safety and also fleeing to areas with resources. And this will strain the nearby countries. Plus the journey itself is really stressful. I've learned a lot in the last year with my field placement. I work with refugees as part of my work there. Just hearing the stories of the travel, of getting to safety, what it's like growing up in a refugee camp in Uganda, that is also putting a lot of stress on their bodies. That's affecting their health in a lot of ways too. And then wouldn't be a good environmentalist if we didn't also talk about climate change. And we know globally we're seeing what we're called climate shocks. And this can include extreme weather events, flooding, cyclones, drought, and others. And I'll focus on the famine-related aspects for tonight. But not only will this destroy lives, it also disrupts crops and livelihoods and can make it difficult for people to feed themselves. And so that's another contributing factor to some of the famine challenges. With chronic poverty, this is people who are unable to afford nutritious food. So this can contribute to undernourishment, which is again setting on that path of long-term health problems. Difficult to work and also difficult to afford food. Global fertilizer costs is one that's got a lot more attention in the last year with the war in Ukraine. This has contributed to a food affordability crisis and then also availability. Globally, fertilizer prices have climbed faster than food prices, and food prices are at a 10-year high. Where the war in Ukraine comes in, and we'll revisit this in more depth later, it's further disrupted global fertilizer production and exports. So we're seeing reduced supplies, raised prices, and impacts on harvests. Wheat, maize, soybean, and rice are four staples, particularly in Africa and a number of Middle East countries. And also globally, so it's just sort of a proportion aspect. Production of all four areas dramatically declined in 2022. And so we also know there's a food availability crisis looming. Listened to a podcast driving in tonight, and they were talking about how Egypt, you don't think of Egypt as a financially struggling country. With the war in Ukraine, Egypt actually had to go and seek aid because they depend on so much grain that they would normally be purchasing from the Ukraine, that they can't. And so in order to be able to afford the higher grain prices of needing to buy it elsewhere, Egypt was seeking international aid for that. Financially, they can do that. A lot of countries don't have that option. Operating costs of organizations have dramatically increased, particularly with food and fuel. We'll talk a lot about the World Food Program tonight. As just one example, their costs of operating in 2022 were 44% higher than in 2019. This is a difference of feeding 4 million people for a month. $14 billion was necessary for World Food Program alone in 2022. That is one organization in the world. Okay? And so this is really a signal that we need to do better about working at underlying causes of famine, because that's not going to be a sustainable level of aid for a lot of these challenges. This one is just a website, a screenshot of a website. World Food Program does what's called a hunger map. And this is updated in real time with data. So you can just go online. Feel free to email me if you have trouble finding the website. If you just Google World Food Program hunger map, it'll bring your countries right up. And so you can see, maybe the font's really small on the bottom, hazards, conflict, undernourishment, current food consumption, vegetation, rainfall, and I'm not actually sure what IPC stands for. I think it might be the famine level, but I didn't use that filter. You can also overlay it with COVID alerts and climate alerts, and pull up country reports. So you'll see a lot of screenshots that I took over the weekend from the hunger map to give you a sense of the visuals with this, but it's a really good monitoring program that will cover 94 countries in the world in real time. talk very briefly about some of the impacts of COVID on the famine. COVID has affected a lot of different aspects of life, and so we're just going to focus mostly on the food-related ones. In the long term, pandemic effects are projected to lead to 30 million more people undernourished by 2030. Okay, so it's not just a brief period of time where we were on lockdown, it really is having broader systemic effects. And the first one we'll discuss is the increased food insecurity. People have experienced reduced incomes and health challenges. In East Africa alone, 5.5 million children are facing high levels of malnutrition due to the compounding effects of COVID, drought, and the Ukraine crisis. So it's a really unfortunate perfect storm of a lot of factors. Less than 40% of children in the Middle East and Northern Africa have access to the nutritious diets they need to grow properly. And then we look at long-term health effects, increased vulnerability from COVID, particularly for elderly and immunocompromised individuals. This makes people more vulnerable to malnourishment, and also makes them vulnerable for further infection. And so when you compound that with already struggling healthcare systems, very wide disparities on vaccine access and treatment access, you're now seeing a really long-term impact of the pandemic on health. With the economic effects, the projections are that the economic impact of COVID-19 will result in about $30 billion in losses due to excess stunting and child mortality. That's just from those two factors, okay? But on the positive note with this issue, for every dollar invested in nutrition, it's estimated that $16 are returned to the local economy. And so while we've seen a lot of effects on health, we can essentially invest our way out of this and make some progress on the health side there at least. Then with supply chain disruptions, this has led to increased food prices and rates of food insecurity. Particularly with this aspect, it's had a disproportionate impact on small-scale farmers. And so different sellers, traders, and shop owners, and people who are part of the informal market, not able to get loans like a lot of people were able to in the US. Developing countries didn't have that. People are going to markets to sell their goods, and no one's going to markets, right? And so it really devastated a lot of the smaller economies. And as one small personal example, one of my colleagues is from Ecuador, and so was able to go back home fairly often. This year was one of his first trips back in a while, and this multiple generation coffee roaster. They'd retired, but they basically had a really hard time staying operative and staying in a business with COVID. People weren't able to travel. There just wasn't the market to get that kind of product out. With employment, the International Labor Organization is a really good source of data on this one. A lot of different impacts on this. Loss of full-time jobs. Estimates are about 500 million globally, particularly with frontline workers, and then migrants and a lot of racial, ethnic minority discrimination experienced. But it's highlighted problems with lack of sick leave, missing and losing jobs because of that, a loss of working hours, and again, those effects on the small business. And then the World Health Organization estimates that just under 7 million people globally have passed away from the pandemic. These are workers, these are families, these are members of communities all over the world. And so that's having certainly an impact on health and nutrition as well. Talk a little bit about the effects of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, prior to Russia's invasion, we're looking at November 2021. The estimates are that 28% of Ukraine's population was experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity. The projections were expected to increase to 40%. And that's before Russia crossed the border again. Okay. And so when you look at the conflict itself, a lot of displacement, a lot of loss of employment, and what we've probably seen the most about is the harm to the agricultural crops and harvesting. The war has disrupted nearly 1/3 of the global wheat market. And this is something we've now seen some of the highest food commodity rates ever. Economically, global food prices have surged at a fastest rate ever. And as of March of last year, it was a 13% jump to record highs. We've seen some of that come down a little bit, but they're still much higher than they were prior to the conflict. Import-dependent countries, such as in the Middle East and Northern Africa, are now having to pay much more because of that much of the grain has been impacted. And to give you a few country examples, the cost of minimum monthly food needs is up 351% in Lebanon, 97% in Syria, and 81% in Yemen. And we'll talk more about how dire the situation already is in Yemen. Wheat, flour, and cooking oil prices are up 47% in the region. And in Somalia, wheat and oil prices increased 300% in one of the poorest countries in the world. Okay, so again, devastating impacts, and Ukraine is, I think I personally was not aware of just what a big role they played with grain production globally, and we really have learned a lot about what that impact really can mean for the global community. And then lastly, with higher natural gas prices, there was a big spike when the conflict first happened. It was worse in Europe because Europe receives about 40% of its natural gas from Russia, and a quarter of that passes through Ukraine. And so they took a much bigger hit than we did. The US could produce a lot of natural gas ourselves, so we were not as affected there. But at one point, the price was up 80% per megawatt hour. And so that's still going to have an economic impact as well. This will show you the hunger map of Ukraine. Red is bad. So the redder something is, the worse the insufficient, or the higher the insufficient food consumption rates are. And so you can see in areas where they're closer to Russia on the eastern side and on the ports, are dealing with pretty high consumption rate. You can overlay different factors if you want to look at where the battles are, explosions and violence, protests, all that kind of thing. You can toggle the different filters, and I try to keep it as clean as possible for presentation's sake. And the nutrition rates, about 8.2% of children under 5 are dealing with acute malnutrition. 22.9% of children under 5 are already facing chronic malnutrition. Like I said, this is a screenshot from the weekend. Okay. So the first case study I want to talk about is Somalia. And in Somalia, about 200,000 people are at risk of famine, 11 million in need. Recent humanitarian assessments do place Somalia at stage 5, which is the famine stage. 3 million people currently are unable to meet their daily needs. And so a lot of different factors in this one. Conflict really is going to be one of the biggest here. Al-Shabaab, which is an Islamist militant group, controls some areas of the country, and the Somali transitional government controls others. A third of the people who are in need of help are living in areas controlled by Al-Shabaab. Civilians are regularly killed, attacked. The fighting parties will cut off access to supplies and services necessary for civilians. The UN Emergency Relief Coordinator has characterized this as a situation where hunger is used as a weapon of war, or tactic of war. Additionally, Somalia is on the front lines for environmental harms. Climate change, droughts, floods, desertification, water scarcity, really struggling, and so the food situations are just exacerbated by everything else. And then give you one example with refugees here. A lot of Somali refugees are fleeing to Kenya and Ethiopia. And so the Dadaab refugee camp is in Kenya. It's one of the largest in the world. And the date of when this was established may surprise you. It was established in 1991. So, doing the math in your head on this one, you now have multiple generations of people who have only known life in a refugee camp. And I encourage you to look up some pictures, read a little bit about this camp. It's not, I think when a lot of Americans hear camp, we think tents. Especially up here where we've got, we camp very differently. Refugee camps, the structures are very different. And with camps like the Dadaab one that have been established for so long, there are schools, there are stores, there are medical facilities. It's much more established than you might initially expect. Over 80,000 people have arrived, most in the last 2 years. 24,000 alone arrived from September through December of last year. Limited resources, also have a cholera outbreak. And the last population estimate I could come across said that there were 218,873 refugees and asylum seekers. So it's a little bit bigger than the population of Green Bay Metro, living in this camp. And with refugees, I won't give you a whole refugee primer. You basically have 3 options as a refugee. go back to your home country, resettle in a third country, or claim asylum. There's a state where you move to, okay? So for people who are in Kenya, maybe they want to stay. Don't want to go back to Somalia. It's tough to find a third country to go to, okay? Kenya will not grant Somali refugees citizenship. So you have a lot of people who essentially feel trapped in this particular facility. And so, as I said, multiple generations are living there. The map, not terribly exciting on this one because the whole country is struggling, so it is red everywhere. Population is 16.4 million people. 14.9 million of those people are dealing with insufficient food consumption. It is literally almost the entire population of the country. That does not include people who have fled to Kenya or have fled to other refugee camps. Okay. So Somalia, an incredibly dire situation. There are a number of Somali refugees that are coming to the U.S. Twin Cities is an area that's resettled quite a few refugees, and a lot of Somalis will come over to Green Bay. We have a growing Somali community there as well, and so that has been a trend continuing for a while. The next one to look at is Nigeria. Boko Haram is a terrorist organization operating in the country that attacks both military and civilian targets, also kidnapping children, especially young girls. And so a lot of political conflict, instability here. And then when we look at areas, it's considered on the brink of famine, but still not great. And there's some geographic disparities, which you'll see on the map. The northeast part of the country is where a lot of the conflict is. And food security is projected to worsen very quickly. The lean season is expected to start in April. And so right now, before the lean sort of harvest season comes up, most areas are at a 3 or 4 on that food insecurity scale, which is getting like the red part towards the bottom, right? 4.1 million people are facing acute food insecurity. Many people are unreachable for humanitarian assistance. We're talking about 700,000 that aid groups can't even get to try and help. They also can't do food security assessments. So areas could be at a famine. We're not able to get in there to get good data on that. And then for the macroeconomic conditions, the government's had a number of economic policies, currency shortages, less government revenue from crude oil and food inflation. So a lot of moving pieces there. Nigeria's population is growing quite significantly. They just had an election a few weeks ago. And so the hope of the international community is that this will lead to a better democracy and more stability, because given the growth with Nigeria's economy, we want to be able to see it stable and see it better address the needs of the people. And so you can see here that northeast area is going to be the worst, gets a little bit better as you go down further south. For the countries that don't have any color, we just don't have data on those, so don't get your hopes up too much that they're doing great. We just don't have good numbers on that. And as you can see, we don't have data on the population because there's been so much movement in and out of the country. But estimates right now, 50.4 million with insufficient food consumption. And so, again, concerning trends on that one as well. With Ethiopia, you'll see some different regional differences here. And in the northern regions, this area is going to be also considered on the brink of famine. 13 million people are in need of food assistance. And we're keeping an eye on this one very closely. In 2022, the agricultural season had a lower than average harvest. And so households are already exhausting their own personal supplies. And so this means they're having to rely on the markets to purchase food, but they're really poor. And so they don't have as much purchasing power and income and can't afford a lot of the food. And so you also have, the risk of famine is improving a little bit here. There's been some really good developments with farming measures and cash subsidies for different farmers, but it really is on the brink and dealing with civil war and conflict as well, also in the northern area. However, a little bit about the dispute between Ethiopia and Eritrea. A lot of reasons for that. There are also concerns about water resources and access there. The Tigray area has temporarily calmed a little bit, so they've been able to restore some services and get some aid into those areas. So some promising steps. In the southern and southeastern areas of the country, you're dealing with drought. And so the problems here are loss of livestock and reduced livestock production, further compounded by water shortage. And then this is leading to that reduction in household access to food and income. At the country level, Ethiopia is facing low government revenue and high inflation, high cost of imports, increase in food prices, especially as you go down the food chain and food is having to travel further. And so you can kind of see, again, that northern area is the worst with famine, and the southern and southeastern are dealing with the drought. But population about 109.2 million, 28.5 with insufficient food consumption. Then we have South Sudan. This area, separate from Sudan, separated a number of years ago and became an independent country. The civil war has led to a lot of mass displacement and abandoned fields and crop failure. So it's classified as a level 3 on the brink, but 7.76 million, about 2/3 of the population, are facing food insecurity. 1.4 million children malnourished. Main factors will be conflict, poor macroeconomic conditions, extreme climate, particularly flooding, high cost of food and fuel. Years of ongoing violence and conflict have displaced 3.5 million people. So families are losing their homes, they're losing cattle and fields to extreme weather events as well. And we've had multi-year flooding. Half of the country's water points have been damaged or destroyed, and we also have cholera. Okay. So some part of the countries are experiencing dry conditions and drought. Other countries are dealing with the other extreme with flooding. It's also one of the most dangerous places in the world to be an aid worker. In 2022 alone, we had 319 violent incidents that targeted humanitarian personnel and assets. And so it's a really dangerous place to be providing assistance on that. And South Sudan, very similar map on this one where it is all facing pretty hefty problems on that. All right, shifting gears to Yemen. Yemen is also considered on the brink of famine, but this is definitely a more controversial designation. I think more people would probably prefer it be listed as a level 5. 1 child dies every 10 minutes from preventable causes, including hunger. World Food Programme's largest emergency response in the world is in Yemen, and they're working to negotiate agreements in a number of conflict areas, but we're looking at over 7 years of armed conflict, and this has created one of the worst humanitarian crises. Civil war began in 2015 between the government and Houthi rebels with connections to Iran. Saudi Arabia led a military coalition, and in 2017, we get a blockade of Yemen's ports, further restricting food supplies and aid. October 2022, conflict is still going, and there are now less funds for humanitarian responses. Rise in global food and fuel prices, and as we all know, COVID will continue on instead of having a delayed effect towards the end of that year as well, and the war in Ukraine. 4.2 million people have been displaced from their homes in Yemen. 17 to 19 million people are classified as food insecure. 23.4 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. What's cool with the World Food Programme, they're designed as like a rapid response unit, and they have their own shipping unit. There's mobile cranes that they can use, and they provide supplies for 40% of Yemeni people each month. 538,000 people are severely malnourished. The rates among women and children are the highest in the world. 3.5 million women and children need treatment for severe malnutrition. 2.2 million children under the age of 5 are at risk of malnutrition. 1.3 million pregnant or breastfeeding women are also at risk for acute malnutrition. So we have multi-generational effects and food risks that are placed here. And then Yemen, again, you can see very similar challenges. A little bit better in the east, but you're still talking very high rates of insufficient food consumption. There are also, again, a lot of civilians are being affected by the drone strikes and conflicts, and it's a really difficult situation for everyone involved in that. This is not advancing for me. Okay, so I'll let you can talk about this. I can keep going. We have a couple other areas of concern. You're going to miss the cool pictures, but this is completely frozen on me. So I'll just keep going. but staying within the camera. So we've got about 20 different hunger hotspots in the UN. Won't do anything. These are areas where the UN is going to be concerned that conflict and economic shocks and natural disasters are all putting millions of lives at risk. Some of the main areas of concern include Afghanistan, Central African Republic, the DRC, Haiti, Honduras, Sudan, and Syria. So we're looking at areas with high food insecurity and additional risk factors like conflict and weather. With Afghanistan specifically, a lot of the funding for aid and development was frozen when the Taliban took over. So about a year ago, things really got difficult, more difficult for the country. And so adding in humanitarian and human rights concerns, and you've got 6 million of the country's 39 million people at risk of famine. 1 million kids face malnutrition and death if they don't get proper treatment. And so it's a really challenging situation. The U.S. has not wanted to negotiate with the Taliban or work with the Taliban as a government. It's really harming the people that are not able to get that aid and that relief right now. Globally, we have very high rates of food insecurity. I only picked a few countries to focus on today. You'll see similar stats in a lot of those areas. For children, we're facing acute malnutrition and developmental issues. Not only are they facing health problems, but you also have issues of their educational effects. So a lot of kids can get pulled out of school and sent to work to support the family. They may also be sent out to beg to get money for the family and may only eat once a day. And that'll have pretty long-term effects on the health. For women, women can be displaced, particularly if they're displaced, will face barriers to work, gender-based violence, forced labor, early marriage, and pregnancy complications that are all made worse by issues with famine. Perfect, thank you.
Sorry, that only took like 5 minutes.
Very good. I'm a teacher. I think we have no problem talking forever. There we go. Okay. See, right on track. On the same slide.
Just to make sure.
Yep, we're good. Thank you. So overall, you're looking at women that are much more likely to lack food overall. And so that's a lot of gender disparities, which is another great decisions talk for another year. So we'll save that one a little bit. I know you had Professor Cohen a few weeks ago talking about refugees. The UNHCR is the High Commissioner on Refugees, and they have, food security is not their primary purpose, but they do really great work with helping, supporting refugees that are in camps in the refugee process of moving to other countries and helping with access for child nutrition and health care. It's not going again. Oh. We got so excited for a second that it was doing things and now it's just moving around on the screen. It won't advance at all for me. Awesome. Okay. Nope. I'm also a Mac person, so this is fun. Okay. It's not doing things. The next organization that we'll look at is the World Food Program. And so with the World Food Program, this is one of the largest UN agencies, and they help around 87 million, let's do this, around 87 million people around the world, about 83 countries. In 2020, they received the Nobel Prize. Nope, not let me do that. Hey. There we go. All right. Listen, 3 years ago, this would have been a nightmare. We're good now. World Food Program is going to have 5,600 trucks, 20 ships, and 92 planes that help deliver food assistance that includes cash-based transfers and people so they can buy local food, and really a quick response on that. They also help with nutrition programs for mothers and children, with school feeding programs that will assist 16 million children in 60 countries. And to highlight a couple of their really successful programs, the first one is the Sahel Resilience Scale Up. And this helps the area, the Sahel region, it deals with erratic rainfall, high food prices, and security issues. What they did in this program is turn 158,000 acres of barren fields into farm and grazing land across 5 countries, benefited 2.5 million people. And so it's been a really cool way to help with resilience to climate shocks and hazards. The R4 Resilience Initiative protects about 360,000 farming and pastoral families from climate hazards, 14 countries, also work really, really well. And then overall, they do a lot of coordination with the governments and private sector. But as we mentioned, they're facing the same dangers of being an aid worker that other organizations are as well. Next, we have the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. I just wanted to highlight them. Their focus is more on broad humanitarian issues, but they have a really good early warning system that they'll work on with World Food Program so that we can intervene earlier and avoid getting to that famine stage, ideally. And then looking at resilience at household and community levels. And then this one is the food insecurity chart of the FAO. This organization is a little bit different. They focus on defeating hunger globally and food security broadly. October 16th is World Food Day, and so they celebrate the founding of the organization at that time. And they started measuring hunger in 1971, and going from left to right, green is, yeah, you might be uncertain on how to obtain food, so mild food insecurity. When you get into the orange, you're starting to make compromises on food quality and variety, reducing the quantity, and starting to probably skip some meals and not know where the next meal is coming from. And then at the far right, kind of equivalent to that red stage that we saw on that IPC level. This is severe food insecurity, where someone has run out of food or gone an entire day at times throughout the year. And so it's a different indicator than the famine level, but still a really important signal of thinking of food challenges that people are facing. Globally, what do we need? Early warning systems are an excellent way to start. That Hunger Map has been a really good development. USAID has another database, and that enables us to make those early interventions and to take the steps to help save lives earlier and ideally try and prevent that famine stage. With cash, this might be a little surprising. World Food Program gives what they call humanitarian cash to 40 million people around 70 countries. This again enables people to buy food locally and to have, get more able to afford supplies to live. One of the types of food that's been really helpful is largely run by UNICEF. And these are ready-to-use therapeutic foods, life-saving supplies that are used to help children with wasting under the age of 5, made from powdered milk, peanuts, butter, vegetable oil, sugar, and a mix of vitamins and minerals. And so this can be a really helpful treatment for severe malnutrition. We also need to look at changes to international humanitarian law. What we saw with Somalia of hunger being used as a weapon really needs to be taken very seriously by the international community. The Security Council recognized this in Resolution 2417, which condemns starving of civilians as a method of warfare, along with the unlawful denial of humanitarian access to civilian populations. We know there's a key link between armed conflict and conflict-induced food security and the threat of famine. Really big step for the Security Council to recognize this as a security issue. But we need better enforcement, we need more action, and we need improved conflict analysis to address such a big driver with famine. World Food Program is a zero hunger program, and I wanted to highlight a few of their solutions as well. The first, I think, is one of the most important, of breaking the cycle of conflict and hunger. In every case study that we looked at today, we saw a huge impact of conflict. Conflict is causing a lot of hunger crises in a lot of countries, even more than we can cover tonight on that. It causes instability in every possible way. We have to take that more seriously. Second is to increase sustainability and build resilience to climate change. Climate extremes are becoming one of the key drivers of severe hunger. Communities are constantly trying to recover. And so there's some really exciting resilience actions that can be taken: reforestation, land rehabilitation, climate insurance for small-scale farmers, and then even access to sustainable energy. So if you have, a generator wiped out, maybe there's solar power or other methods of obtaining energy than just natural gas, or whatever the case may be on that. Next, we can look at strengthening ways to address poverty and inequality through social safety nets. The humanitarian cash is a good way, but also with health access and A lot of countries don't have a welfare type of program or food aid or badger care or food share equivalents internationally. Thinking of those kinds of programs to support people when they're struggling. Helping rural farmers connect to markets is another really important aspect. Small-scale farmers make up the majority of people living in poverty. And so a lot of these economic losses that they're experiencing are due to lack of storage, fertilizer, farming equipment, and those climate extremes. So the idea here is to have better connections from those farmers to the markets. And some of it can be simple things like having roads, bridges, refrigeration, transportation, electricity. There are really tangible ways we can better connect farmers to markets to sell their goods. The fifth one, reducing food waste and food loss. A third of the food produced for human consumption each year is lost or wasted. This costs the global economy about $1 trillion annually. In high-income countries, this waste occurs at home. In low-income countries, the food is lost at those early stages before it can even get to a market. Again, due to that storage issue or farmers not able to get their wares to sell. And so we can strengthen that part as well. And then eliminating malnutrition in mothers and children. This gets at a lot of the gender inequality issues. If women farmers had the same resource access as men, we could decrease the number of hungry people by 150 million. A lot of reasons for that. In a lot of cultures, women are doing a lot of the growing, harvesting, preparing food for markets, particularly in poorer countries. And so there's a huge gender disparity consideration to think about. And that gets into the, health and malnutrition, particularly with children. And for fun, or when you want to avoid grading, you can go, World Food Program has a game called Free Rice. Asks you just different questions, and they donate 10 grains of rice for every correct question. So that's kind of a fun one to, kids at school do it. It's a really fun one to look at. So I always like to kind of wrap up with a couple slides on what we can do, because I think these issues are big, they're difficult, they get really depressing really quickly. It's kind of my specialty doing this for this many number of years. And so a lot of these come from a group called Global Citizen. And I think, starting with supporting organizations, and the next slide has a few more specific ones, but World Food Program really are the heroes with this, and they're able to respond very quickly, and so they're a great one to support. Promoting a planetary health diet. Yes, this does include eating less meat. No, I'm not coming for your burgers. Okay? Part of the rationale for that is that industrial meat leads to deforestation. So by having more diverse diets, having more fruit and vegetables, you're supporting local communities and essentially just having a more nutritious life. So again, I love a burger. No idea my excitement when Wahlburgers came to Green Bay. So not telling you can't eat burgers, it's just to think of diversifying the diet a little bit. Eliminating our food waste. 40% of food produced, again, worldwide is wasted, ends up in landfills. It's about 1.3 billion tons of food that's produced and never consumed. So whether it's composting, mentioning the seed library that you have here, really good to use on your gardens. It's one way to kind of help global aspects with that and help with the resource use as well. A lot of farms are really crops are water intensive. And so that's one way to make a difference. Investing in climate smart agriculture. The global food system is responsible for 31% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can have better agriculture, we still have farmers, we're helping to improve the overall global impact. Helping people afford nutritious diets, so addressing that undernutrition. This will include lower costs of healthy food through subsidies, investing in healthy food production. And then lastly, with universal school meals. 73 million students lack reliable access to school meals. When we have meals provided in schools, healthier kids, it frees up family income, which is really critical in poorer countries and poorer communities, can support local farmers, and also long-term productivity as the kids are not only able to stay in school, but they're able to do better. When kids are able to, they're not sitting there hungry, they're able to concentrate, they're able to stay in school and actually get an education and advance. And so I think overall, learning about what we can do, sharing it, and then acting. And so the last one, just listed some few organizations. World Food Program we talked about quite a bit. You may have heard about Feed My Starving Children. This is it's a Christian-based organization that will partner with churches to pack meal packages, and then they send those out to partner countries. So it's very like an assembly line, like someone's got the rice, someone's got the vegetables and powder, and you kind of go down the line on that. Since 2009, they have sent food to 222 partners in 109 countries. The one that is most sentimental for me is the World Central Kitchen. This was founded by Jose Andres in 2010 after the Haiti earthquakes, famous, again, celebrity chef. And not only does it provide food, which is great, his belief in it is so inspiring and just really positive and affirming, because for him, food is a way of providing comfort, and it is a way of providing hope for people in really dire situations. And so he's responded all over the world, I think over 30 countries last year. I would not be surprised if they had a tent set up this morning in Mississippi after the tornadoes that just went through. It's not just international. When we had the floods in Tennessee not long ago, they were there within 24 to 48 hours. They were on the border of Poland immediately after the Ukraine war started. And so they partner with local kitchens, and so it's a way to help local farmers as well, local restaurateurs, but just hit the mindset that we're going to make people feel better in a really bad moment. It's not a long-term fix, it's an immediate response kind of thing. Kiva is one that I also really like, I've been involved with for a long time. They give microcredit loans to individuals in about 79 different countries. So they'll partner with a local bank and people who couldn't get loans otherwise. And so my very first loan was to a woman named Imelda in the Philippines so that she could buy a fishing net. That was the loan. And that loan, it was repaid. Almost all of mine have been, very few have defaulted. That enabled her to earn an income for her family because she was able to go fish. And I like the personal connection that I will forever think of Imelda in the Philippines as someone that I was able to help a little bit. And so I think I always tell my students when these problems get really big and really overwhelming, these are the little steps that we can take that really can matter. Care International will focus on, again, emergency response with farmers and pastoralists for crop productivity, market access, and family nutrition. They have a pretty good gender component as well, with emphasizing women as consumers and inclusive governance. So they do a lot more than food-related issues, so they're a good humanitarian one. And then the last one to highlight is the 1 Acre Fund. This works in Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and Malawi. And they provide seeds and fertilizers to farmers based on credit. So that makes the seeds affordable and accessible. They served 3.2 million farmers in 2021. And for the farmers they served, increased the productivity by 40% per year. Incredibly successful by giving them seeds. Okay, and so had a really big impact on that. They also do a lot of agricultural training on how to improve harvest and building relationships with traders and ways to store crops. And so there are a lot of great organizations that are out there. So these are just a couple of my personal favorites and ones that I know are really active. And so with that, thank you for your patience with the tech issues, and I am happy to take questions.
We came through with actually seeing all the slides. Sorry about that.
We got all of them.
Let you carry it. Thanks to your moxie, we made it through. And so, if anyone has questions or comments, raise your hands. Linda will be working the right side of the room today. Lisa, at least at the beginning, will be working the left side, and I will be online. So, our first question is right here.
Hi. Talked about, or are there any organizations out there that try to educate on population control? Because it seems to me.
That's a good question. The UN Women will do quite a bit of that. There's a lot of different organizations that will talk about family planning. It's difficult depending on the country because of restrictions on religious views and what NGOs are allowed to work on depending on the country. So that certainly has been a challenge, but at the UN level, UN Population Fund is another really good one. I think more organizations have tried to frame things as women's health. and how women can take care of themselves, take care of their bodies, what their options may be. And one thing that I've seen in my work with World Relief is it's often the first time that there has been an all-female space to have these health conversations. And so people haven't thought about having a choice about whether they wanted to have children, and the health risks with that, the financial considerations. And so there just hasn't been that conversation.
Educating men would be good.
Yeah, and it's that's fair. We can debate on that one, but at the international, there have been NGOs that work on that. I think it's easier for the UN to do that than it is for non-governmental organizations because of some of the government restrictions on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, what about organizations that deliver food to countries and their political leaders, their political organizations don't distribute it to their population in some ways to keep their population down and under control under their regime?
Yeah, and that's certainly been a big challenge. I think, we didn't talk about North Korea. That's been one of the big criticisms, is that what little aid can get into the country is not being distributed. And that's where I think the need for the political reforms come in, of whoever's going to be negotiating that, whether it's World Food Program trying to negotiate with the governments. There have been some agreements made at one point. I don't think the agreement is still in place. Russia did agree to allow aid to go through to Ukraine, because at the time they controlled the ports. And so that's where there has to just be the political will. Every country is sovereign under the UN Charter. You can't make a country do something. There are certain leverage mechanisms that you have. You can build in sanctions. You can build in incentives for a country. But at the end of the day, the country has to make a choice to do that. And that's, I think, one of the really frustrating aspects, that you see the people suffering. I think Yemen's a good example with that too. You see people suffering, and someone has to make a choice for that to stop. Yeah. I don't have a good answer or a happier answer on that one for you.
The microphone is on the way.
The Western financial system that basically they went to those countries in Africa and other countries like that, and they basically impose austerity in many of these governments.
Yep.
And for example, you were talking about Egypt, where Egypt subsidizes the agriculture.
Yep.
That even here, Republicans will not cut subsidies to agriculture, and they were forced to do that. The Western economic system, and could you tell us that is pretty much what is causing all this hunger, a huge cause?
Yeah, I think the subsidies they're a different conversation when you're looking at famine, because in some ways, the subsidies can be helpful if it's a situation of extreme poverty, because it can make it affordable. So I want to say that all subsidies are bad, but the system and how subsidies are used can be challenging. That if you have over-subsidized something for so long, when you then experience a shock and you have to go buy it somewhere else, you now are paying so much more than you would if those systems hadn't been in place. And I think for particularly a lot of the countries that are emerging from into a post-colonial era, that were controlled by European powers, it's a different conversation, because there was a dependence that was created economically and trade relationships that were built in from the colonizing country. And so that brings in a really difficult challenge for some areas as well, of sort of shedding that colonial past and developing a new economy, or for new countries like South Sudan, how you're going to structure your economy, how you're going to structure subsidies, whether you're going to subsidize or not. So I think it can be an effective tool, but it's really difficult to use effectively. So it's going to be a lot of variability on the countries with that one. Yeah.
I have a question. Hold on.
Yes, you do.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Limited to one for right now.
So pick your best one.
Do you know what is the population of Mother Earth right now?
I don't know. There's too many other numbers in my head tonight, I'm afraid.
Well, I just,
I'll phone a friend on this one.
Yeah, another question.
so the follow-up to that is, I believe it was on public TV the other night, they said, they estimated it's at 7 billion. And the Earth can only support 10 billion. And we're increasing our population about 1 billion every 10 years. So in 30 years, we'll be maxed out. So what's the answer to that?
Well,
Take the time, think about it for 10 seconds or so.
switching gears with my population control hat. And also the disclaimer, I am not an expert on population control. I think the carrying capacity question is a really important one. That you will naturally have some loss. They're living longer overall, although COVID has reduced the average life expectancy a bit. But people are living longer, but they're still not living forever. So you will have some natural cycling and changing of population numbers, but that's a really important question. And I think you can look at it, they say, okay, we know the numbers are gonna grow, how can we be more efficient? So even though using the resources, US is not great on that. Another really interesting exercise once you finish playing for your ice is to calculate your carbon footprint and find out how many people you essentially equal. Okay, I live a mile from campus. I drive to work. It's also cold. We live in Wisconsin. So I'm not the best environmentalist on that. That's going to factor into my carbon footprint. I can't take mass transit. Where am I buying my groceries? All of those factors will affect not just the number of the population, but what we're using and the resources we're consuming. And so I think the resource consumption is a better way to think of it than just population numbers, because we can get more efficient. I think the population issue gets really difficult, and especially when you look at really difficult histories like with China and the one-child policy and attempts that they have taken. Learned a lot more about that in recent years, because I had a student who very bravely shared a lot with me about kind of their experiences growing up in that system. It's horrifying kind of what happened. And so I don't necessarily think that that kind of policy is the way to go. I think I'd rather see it shift more to a resource efficiency and informed decision. So back to the, kind of the first question with family planning conversations, women's health conversations, and doing the best we can to support the people who are here. But we need to get better. We need to start making better decisions and get thinking of the resources that we're using on that.
Here you go. Here you go. Here you go. Here you go.
I guess I got a related comment question. I realize we have a world family, but right now we produce more than enough food and resources in the world to feed the entire planet.
Yep.
Is that true?
Yep. Yeah, and a lot of it goes back to sort of the waste component that, a lot of it is wasted, and it's wasted in different ways. And so again, developed countries, we tend to waste it more at home. Developing countries, the waste tends to happen at that early stage of production where they can't get it to market, or there's not enough storage. There's a really interesting New Yorker article. I'm about 3 months behind in the New Yorker, so it probably was August or September that I read a few weeks ago. I'm committed. I'm going to get caught up. I just read December 1st. So there's a really interesting article that talked about refrigeration technology and what that could mean for rural communities in countries dealing with agricultural issues. That, could they... how do you, it's really expensive, of course. You have to train people how to use it, but that could open up a lot of potential for some of the small scale farmers, or again, people in rural communities, to get their goods to other markets. And so that's just one. We're also having roads, electricity, things that we can do without ending, civil wars. There are, I think, some of those tangible steps that really can help with that. She's coming straight back. Yep.
Yeah, I had a professor in college that simplified this whole thing and causal facts by saying that 100% hunger and starvation were in a direct proportion to how good the government was. And used as an illustration that the paintings in Siena of good government, you know, where everything is flourishing, and bad government, where everything is just going to hell. And in your examples, I mean, there's not a place that you mentioned where starvation is high, where the government is worth a damn. And so there's a lot of politics. There's a lot of politics in starvation.
Yep.
I just want, I know I didn't ask your question.
It was implied, I got you.
I wanted you to know if you think he oversimplified.
I think there's a strong correlation there, because I think that a good government is able to meet the needs of its citizens and to organize resources effectively. And I know this is an international talk, but we look at what the governor of Minnesota signed with providing universal school meals. That's one state in the U.S. And what that is going to mean, and there's incredible research on what giving just, again, 1 or 2 meals a day, most schools now do also breakfasts, which is fun if you talk to your elementary teacher friends and kids in cereal and milk, and they're 5. So it's a little bit messy on that. But there's really good research on what that can do for health of the kids. And I think that's what the governor did is going to save a lot of lives. That's a choice that they made in Minnesota. Not a lot of states have made that choice. It wasn't a political choice. It was a decision about resources. He wanted to make sure kids had food when they went to school. Not the Republican kids, not the Democrat kids. It was, we want to feed some kids so they can eat when they come to school. And that, I think, is an example where I would argue that's a good government example, regardless of individual feelings about him. At the end of the day, a lot of kids are going to have better food security. Now, developing countries aren't going to be able to do that kind of program, but they can allow NGOs to come in. They can facilitate with the World Food Program. And governments have to make that choice. And I think there's still some shame associated in some governments that, do you want the World Food Program supplying food to 70% of your kids? Probably not. So I think there's a little bit of pride that can be involved there. But that's why the World Food Program can be so successful, is I think, at least my impression with this, is most of their staff is embedded in the country. So it's not like you have someone flying over from DC and telling them exactly what they're going to operate and how it's going to work. They're really immersing themselves in the communities, and they're with the mindset of helping. And so I think that's the kind of government decision making. But the conflicts, there are choices that can be made there. There are choices with women's health and access and hospitals and that kind of thing. And so I think it's a good, a little bit oversimplification, but I think it's a good idea to think about that correlation and what an effective government can do.
Is Heifers International good or a bad?
Yeah, they're good. And if you ever are curious about an organization, Charity Watch is a really good site that it'll tell you what the budget is, salaries of the leadership, how much of your donation goes to the work of the organization versus administrative. Charity Navigator is another really good one. It was tough to narrow it down. I think Feeding America, I think, is a nice one in the U.S. We certainly don't have we don't have the famine levels. We certainly do have malnutrition and sort of food security levels in a lot of communities that people don't necessarily think about. If you've ever volunteered with Meals on Wheels or that kind of thing, we have food challenges in the U.S. as well. They're just not at the scale of the countries that we've seen. Yeah.
We actually have time for questions today. Professor Beat structured her presentation so that we did. So if you do have any questions, don't be shy, because we actually have some time to ask and discuss things tonight. So don't be shy, ask away. And if you're following online, same thing, ask away.
I just, in your perspective, okay, you have conflict, and I agree that it's a major source, but right now, a lot of conflict is caused by the migration of people into other countries caused by climate change. So between government conflict and climate change, what do you think is the worst, is the one that challenge us the most, like as of this year?
I feel like that's picking between like which sports teams I dislike most. If we're going to go with the Eagles or Steelers, that's a tough call. Sorry, Pennsylvania friends watching, because they're both terrible. I think, and neither one of them is an easily solvable issue either. With conflict, it's the migration part is separate. Yes, there is some conflict with migration, but most of the ones that are causing the famine effects are more like civil wars or rebel insurrections and that kind of thing. It's not caused by refugees going into Kenya. And so the conflict, it's different. And I think Yemen is a good example too, where you have destruction of buildings. You have, again, these are not refugees that are doing that. It's usually rebels, or in some cases Saudi Arabia, with drones coming in. A lot of debate on that one, with the international coalition that they're leading. And so I think, and my bias might be a little bit more towards the environmental side, just because that's more of what I spend my time doing. The climate change aspect has so many moving pieces, and in some countries, you're starting to see a debate resurface over the facts of climate change and away from the solutions with it. Internationally, that's not the case, but some of the larger countries have raised that issue. And it's not like you can stop global warming and suddenly end the drought. You can't pour some more water on something and end the drought. If there's a war and two factions are bombing each other, you can stop the bombing. Now, that doesn't deal with the infrastructure issues and the long-term trauma and harm and crop issues, but I think it's a more finite issue with some of the conflicts than it is with climate change. We're seeing temperature rise, and I think it's one of the Leonardo DiCaprio movies. I forget if it was After the Flood or one of his two. There's a national security expert that they have in there, and they overlay the GIS of conflicts and where we're seeing them occur and water shortages. And it's almost a perfect correlation, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. That kind of conflict, when it's a conflict over resources, is very different than if it's a civil war or political conflict. And so that, I think, is the ultimate perfect storm of the two biggest factors. And, Ethiopia and Eritrea are fighting over water. We're going to see some big fights coming over the Nile River, and how that's being used and how that's being accessed. Water, I think, is going to be one of the biggest challenges. And again, it's a little more tangential to kind of what we're talking about tonight on that, but that is going to lead to more migration. And then I think we will see more of the risks of conflicts, especially in communities that have more tribal bases, where you have warring factions that may have to move to survive, not moving for a political purpose, really more for crops and agriculture. FAO and some other companies, Europe is very anti-GMO, but there are developments, Monsanto is doing some with drought-resistant seeds. And that, I think, is a really interesting debate over GMOs broadly. Should we be genetically modifying food? But what if it can help people? What if you can develop a Frankenstein drought-resistant seed? Kind of seems like a privilege problem to say someone shouldn't have it when they're in a drought and you're sitting there with a steak. So I think that's an interesting conversation. Europe is very anti-GMO with the EU. US is a little more mixed on that. So I think there's a lot of interesting debates with that. But so yeah, I can't pick a team between those two. I might lean a little more towards climate change being harder, but neither one of them is great. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Up front. Yeah. She's coming.
There we go.
I was wondering, is there any way to assess how these countries were doing before colonization? Were they at war a lot, or were they functioning better, or were they taking care of themselves?
That's a good question. In terms of data, not really, because of the FAO has been tracking some of this for quite a while. I forget the exact year that the World Food Program was created. FAO was, I should look this one up today because I was curious on the dates with the two. I feel like it was early 1900s on the FAO, 1945. But they didn't start measuring hunger until 1974. And so it is difficult. Maybe the colonizer tried to measure doubtful. That's a big ask of them. So it is more difficult to measure famine and hunger levels. In terms of services that were provided, yeah, you can look up information on self-governance questions. You know, did the colonized country have their own government? What decisions were they allowed to make? How were they taxed? I forget who asked the question earlier of the financial history with some of these countries, especially when they were coming out of colonization, taking loans from the IMF and World Bank that had crushing interest. And so they're then spending more money as they're trying to develop and trying to service that debt. You can ask anyone with student loans about this one. We're suddenly all economists then. But if you're spending so much money paying that interest, you're not developing your country. And that's a big post-colonial legacy as well, is trying to wrestle with those that financial history. There's a big movement, I think, mid-90s, late 90s, somewhere in there, of debt forgiveness, and so you'll see the highly indebted poor countries indication of ways that if you, and we're going to see this with student loans, hopefully soon, if you forgive a country's debt, you're never going to see it paid back anyway, okay? If you forgive a country's debt, that can have a huge economic impact on their development. Then they can spend the money on those hospitals. They can spend the money on agriculture because they're not paying interest on a debt they're never going to be able to repay. And so that, I think, is a important aspect of the colonial past to think about. But a lot of the countries, it's just been difficult to start a new chapter in kind of their history on that.
Anyone else?
Part of the question, parts.
Sure.
When you talk about GMO product seeds that can resist drought or plague or whatever.
Yep.
All I can think of is, the green revolution that was going to save everybody. And in fact, there were many unintended consequences in terms of the cost of the seeds, fertilizer, water consumption. And I don't see how anything has changed either in the corporate mindset or governmental attitudes towards aids towards less developed countries that is going to think very hard about the unintended consequences. Because if you say, fine, Monsanto will make these seeds and they'll resist drought, everybody will say, well, cool beans, yeah.
And that's a fair question with that too. And I think that Monsanto could make them, but someone has to buy them. And that's where I think the EU opposition gets a little bit challenging, that the World Food Program, yes, you can donate to it, but they're also funded by donations from member states in that UN organization. And so if they wanted to develop a policy that some of the members were very upset about, that could affect the funding for that organization. And so Monsanto and any company that wants to manufacture a product, someone has to be willing to pay for it. Someone has to buy it. And so, can they create demand for it? Maybe. I think there could be potential on this, but it's a matter of where the political and financial will come from. Does it actually work? The FAO does a lot of agricultural programs kind of like that, because they tend to focus more on long-term agriculture, whereas World Food Program is more immediate responses. And so I have not looked into whether the FAO has done any kind of trial projects. I think that would be a really interesting question. That has what is the research on, do these work? Are we seeing them be successful in areas dealing with drought? Or are we just saying, well, they shouldn't live there because it's a drought area? I don't know. That's an area that I have not done a deep dive in, but I'd be really curious to see what the success and what the where they're at with that. I just know it's been in discussion for a while.
Anyone else? No? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending Professor Wood's lecture, and we will see you in a year.
Next
and if
year.
you want seats, you can get some personally on the way out of the library tonight. So thank you all for coming. Have a great night.